In the cold silence of silver pine forest, a little girl plays an old melody on a rusted harmonica. And from the darkness, hoofbeats answer. No one knows. Is it the spirit of an unfinished song or the past returning to reclaim the truth long buried? This isn't just music. It's a calling. And tonight, it will be answered. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another haunting and emotional story from us. The moon was heavy that night, pregnant with secrets, casting a pale, unblinking gaze over the vast Colorado wilderness. Silver pine. A sleepy forest hollow forgotten by time was swaddled in shadows. The trees swayed with an invisible rhythm, whispering to one another, their leaves trembling as if trying to speak. Somewhere beneath that lunar hush, in a crooked cabin, leaning into the wind, like an old man with a story to confess, a girl breathed music into the night. Nora sat on the warped windowsill, her bare feet tucked under her flannel nightgown, fingers curled around a tarnished harmonica. She exhaled slow and deep into the brass, and the melody that came out was not childish. It wasn't bright or playful. It was worn like something handed down through aching hands. The notes slipped out one by one, like fragments of a lullaby that once meant something now weathered by silence and years. She didn't play for anyone, not the trees, not the stars. She played because no one else remembered the song. Inside the cabin creaked like it too had lungs and memories. The wallpaper peeled in curling strips, revealing wood that had darkened with sorrow. A cast-iron stove hissed faintly, barely holding a fire. On a narrow bed pushed against the wall, Nora's grandmother stirred beneath a quilt of frayed reds and greens, coughing into a cloth that came away spotted with something darker than time. Nora turned slightly, harmonica still resting against her lips. Her eyes were large and unblinking, the kind of eyes that had learned too early how to read silence. She watched her grandmother for a moment, then slipped down from the windowsill and moved across the floor on the balls of her feet. Her shadow stretched long behind her, a fragile thread of a girl moving through a house, held together by splinters and memory. She dipped a cloth in a bowl of water and pressed it gently to her grandmother's forehead. The old woman's stirred eyes fluttering open, a whisper caught between confusion and fever. Amelie. Nora froze. She didn't answer, just tucked the quilt tighter the way her mother used to do. The name was a ghost, and ghosts weren't welcome in Nora's voice. She returned to the window without saying anything, not even a breath. The harmonica met her mouth again. This time the song was different, not mournful, but questioning. Like a child knocking on a door she wasn't sure she wanted opened. Her breath grew steadier, the notes trembled less. They rose, fell, then rose again, in a sequence her fingers didn't remember, but her body did. And then it came, a sound. From somewhere beyond the tree line, deep within the blue-black tangle of forest, something answered. It wasn't a howl, not a coyote or the scrape of a branch. It was higher, tighter, a shrill, slivered sound that hovered in the air like glass suspended before shattering. A horse's whinny, but it wasn't wild or panicked. It was rhythmic, musical, as though the animal wasn't just calling out, but replying. Nora's fingers slipped off the harmonica holes. Her breath hitched. She leaned forward, forehead nearly pressed against the cold, fogged glass eyes scanning the woods. But there was nothing, just the pale quilt of moonlight draped over silver pine. And then a second sound. This one dull and deliberate. Clop, clop, clop. The unmistakable echo of hooves on hard earth. Not frantic, not fast. Steady. Like a heartbeat. Like applause after a performance no one else could hear. Nora held her breath. Her hand gripped the wooden sill. For a moment, the old cabin, the fevered grandmother. The sorrow soaked into the walls. All of it disappeared. There was only her, the moonlight, and the invisible partner keeping time beyond the pines. Behind her a coughing fit broke out, raw, hollow, desperate. The sound of a body losing its war against winter. Nora snapped out of the trance. She spun on her heels and moved to her grandmother's side, dropping the harmonica in her pocket. The old woman's chest rattled with each breath. Her fingers clutched at the quilt like she was sinking. Shh, Nora whispered, even though she didn't know if her voice would help. I'm here. She wiped her grandmother's lips, brought a spoon of herbal tea to her mouth. But the woman turned her face away, lips dry and cracked. She stared out at nothing, eyes glassy with something more than sickness, grief maybe, or a memory she couldn't outrun. On the nightstand beside the bed sat an old photograph, its corners curled and faded to amber. In the picture, a woman with the same eyes as Nora, eyes too big for her face, too solemn for her age, stood smiling in front of a red and gold circus tent. One arm slung around a man with wild dark hair and a conductor's baton. Between them, A magnificent black horse stood tall mid-prance, as though even the camera couldn't quite freeze it. Someone had scratched across the man's face with a red pen now faded to rust. A jagged X splitting his eyes. Nora glanced at the picture, then away. That image had always scared her, not because of the man, but because of what it did to her grandmother every time she looked at it. Something in her would shrivel. Something in her would flinch. She returned the photo face down, hiding it from the room. Wind howled outside. The window rattled in its frame. A draft slithered through the cracks in the wood, lifting the curtains just enough to let in the sound again, this time closer. The whinny, followed by the rhythmic clop, clop, then silence. Nora rose slowly, her bare feet silent against the floorboards. She moved back to the window, drawn not by curiosity, but something deeper. A pull, like a memory she never made but knew she had. Outside, the forest shimmered under the moonlight. The trees had stopped moving. Even the wind held its breath. She pressed her fingers against the window pane. Her reflection stared back pale, freckled hair, a mess of chestnut curls. But behind it, for just a second, something flickered. A shape. Large. Dark. Just at the tree line. And then it was gone. She blinked. The harmonica in her pocket suddenly felt heavy. Like it didn't belong to her, but to something older, hungrier. Something waiting. The candle beside her flickered, then flared, then died. In the dark, Nora didn't scream. She just listened. Because somehow the silence was louder than any fear. In the room behind her, her grandmother murmured something, a name again, but not Amelie this time. Zephyr. Nora's breath caught. The harmonica pressed against her leg. She stepped back from the window, eyes wide. Zephyr. She didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But the sound of it. It made something in her chest flutter like wings inside a jar. From the open window came one last faint clop, then nothing. The night returned to stillness. But it wasn't the same night. Something had passed through it. Something had left a mark. Nora moved slowly to the rocking chair beside her grandmother's bed and sat down. She took the harmonica from her pocket, held it in her lap. Her fingers shook. She raised it to her lips, played the first note. It was shaky, uncertain. But before she could finish the phrase, a breeze swept through the room again. Not cold, not harsh. Just there. Like breath. Like memory. The curtains lifted, twirled once, then fell. And in the breath between notes, the whisper of hooves echoed again in the woods, like a promise or a warning. Nora closed her eyes and played. The morning came reluctantly, dragging a thin mist behind it, like a torn veil. The forest surrounding Silver Pine held tight to the remnants of night, refusing to give up the shadows between its branches. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a sound stirred, one that didn't belong to wind or birdsong, but something heavier. Something remembered. Nora wrapped her flannel coat around her narrow shoulders and stepped off the porch boots, crunching frost-bitten leaves. A woven basket hung from her elbow, swaying gently with every determined step. She didn't ask permission. Her grandmother was still asleep, breathing ragged, the room filled with the soft ticking of the old clock on the mantel, and the silence that always came after a hard night. The woods embraced her like an old secret. She walked the trail she knew by heart, down the slope past the moss-covered log left at the broken birch. The deeper she went, the less human the world became. The sky was nothing more than fragmented light filtered through pine needles and grief. She bent low to gather sticks, snapping brittle limbs and loading them into the basket. Her fingers were numb, her breath visible. Yet beneath the ache of cold, there was a heat inside her chest. That sound from the night before, those hooves, that voice, it hadn't been a dream. Something had answered her. Something real. She stood upright, closed her eyes, and listened. At first there was nothing, just the hush of trees breathing and the faint hum of wind twisting through the hollows. Then it came again, a low whinny, close, intentional. Her eyes snapped open, not 20 feet ahead, just beyond a curtain of ferns, browned by the season. Something moved. At first, all she could see was shadow, a bulk that shifted against the trees like spilled ink. Then a flicker of movement, the elegant curve of a neck, the glint of a wild eye catching the morning light. A horse, not just any horse. It was black. Not the polished black of fairy tales or fables, but a dusty, bruised kind of black, like a coal that had forgotten how to burn. Its ribs showed beneath its coat. Its mane was tangled with pine needles and time. And there along its left shoulder stretched a jagged scar, flesh that had once been torn, now healed into memory. Nora didn't move. The horse stood still as a monument, eyes fixed on her breath, pluming in short white clouds. The forest held its breath too. There was a tension now, a fragile thread drawn taut between the girl and the beast, vibrating with something neither fully understood. She slowly reached into her coat pocket and wrapped her fingers around the harmonica. She didn't speak. Words would break the spell. Instead, she lifted the metal to her lips and blew a single note. It was soft, pure, a signal. The horse's ears twitched. She continued note by note, rebuilding the melody she'd played the night before. Zephyr's Waltz. She didn't know how she knew the name. It wasn't something her grandmother had ever said aloud. But somehow her fingers remembered the phrasing, the little lift between bars 3 and 4, the way the last note dipped into silence, like a goodbye caught in the throat. And then the impossible happened. The horse stepped forward. One hoof, then another, but not randomly. It stepped in rhythm. To her. Clop. Pause. Clop, clop, like a dancer counting beats in its head. Nora's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. She played on the melody, curling through the trees like smoke. The horse came closer. 10 feet now. 5. Close enough that she could see its eyes clearly. One dark as night, the other clouded with the faint silver sheen of an old injury. A broken mirror still reflecting. The harmonica faltered as emotion flooded her throat. She couldn't explain it, but this horse, she knew it. Not from a photograph, not from a story, from somewhere deeper. Like it had been left behind just for her, or maybe she had been left behind just for it. She lowered the harmonica. They stared at each other. The wind moved around them, and then, almost on instinct, she reached into the front pocket of her dress. Her fingers brushed velvet. She pulled it out, a small pouch frayed at the seams. Inside, a silver locket, tarnished, oval-shaped. The clasp stiff from years of silence. She'd found it tucked inside her mother's music case after the funeral. No one ever mentioned it. Her grandmother never asked. But Nora wore it some days when the air felt heavier, like today. She opened it. On one side, a tiny portrait of her mother, smiling eyes alive with fire. On the other, a swirl of music notes etched by hand, slightly smudged. Zephyr's ears twitched. She stepped forward slowly, cautiously. Nora extended the locket in her palm, the chain dangling like a silver thread from her wrist. Zephyr lowered her head. For a long breath, nothing happened. Then her muzzle touched the locket. Just once, soft, deliberate, like a memory returned. And with that touch, something inside the air cracked open. Nora's eyes fluttered shut. And suddenly, she wasn't in the woods anymore. She was beneath a striped red and gold tent so tall, it seemed to scrape the stars. The world glowed with lanterns, alive with laughter and applause. Brass instruments blared. A spotlight cut through the dark and landed on a small raised platform. Her mother stood there, hair braided in a crown around her head, harmonica to her lips. The same song, Zephyr's Waltz, filled the tent like magic made flesh. And beside her, a younger Zephyr, sleek, proud, shining with sweat and purpose. She trotted in perfect rhythm to the music hooves, tapping out the beat. She reared at the crescendos, bowed at the rests. The crowd roared. In the shadows near the curtain, a man watched with folded arms and unreadable eyes. A baton tucked in his vest pocket. A scar over his eyebrow. Then crack, a sound, a scream. The spotlight burst. The tent trembled. Nora gasped and the vision shattered. She was back in the forest. Zephyr was still there, head bowed, eyes soft. Nora didn't know how long she had been standing. The locket dangled loose in her hand. She looked up at the sky. The clouds had parted. The moon from the night before still lingered in the pale sky, translucent, as if reluctant to disappear. And in that moment it happened. The light passed through the clearing, just right. Moonlight or sunlight or something in between, and it hit them both, the girl and the horse. Their shadows stretched together, touching, framed in white. A living painting, a moment carved from silence and silver. She took a step closer, and Zephyr didn't move. Not away, not forward, just stayed, like she'd been waiting. Nora smiled. It was small, but it was real. The sun was low by the time Nora led Zephyr through the back trail behind the house, the light slanting gold and sharp through the branches like blades drawn in reverence. Her hands gripped the rope she'd fashioned from old bedsheets, tied gently around the mare's neck, though Zephyr didn't need leading. She followed close behind, steps, deliberate, head low, as if she too understood the necessity of silence in this return. The path had long grown over. Brambles clawed at Nora's dress. The narrow footbridge across the creek groaned under the weight of memory. A squirrel darted across their path and disappeared into the brush. But Zephyr didn't flinch. She was already watching something deeper. Something behind the house, behind the years, behind the silence. The old stable sat half sunken into the ground, leaning on one side like a wounded animal. Ivy crawled across its roof. One of the doors hung on a single hinge, the other missing entirely. The wood had gone gray from weather and time. A place abandoned, not just by people, but by forgiveness. Nora stood at the threshold, breath held. Zephyr stepped past her. Inside, dust rose like smoke, a rusted water trough. A bale of hay fossilized in the corner. A faded name painted on the back wall, Zephyr half chipped the Y, barely legible. The mare stopped and looked around. Then, like instinct, she walked to the corner where a tattered, sun-bleached blanket lay folded over a beam. She nudged it once, then curled into herself, lowering her body slowly to the ground. Nora watched in awe. Something ancient stirred in the air, some rhythm her young heart didn't have the words for. Like watching someone return to their childhood bedroom after a war. She stepped inside after her, gently untying the rope, brushing Zephyr's coat with her sleeve. The scar on Zephyr's shoulder twitched under her touch, not in pain, but in remembrance. Nora sat beside her in the straw, pulled the harmonica from her pocket, and played just 3 notes quietly. Zephyr blinked. The corners of her mouth curled in a soundless echo. Then a voice rang out like thunder from the doorway. "What in God's name is that?" Nora flinched. Her grandmother stood at the edge of the clearing, gripping the edge of the sagging doorway, one hand to her chest. Her face had gone pale beneath her worry lines, eyes locked on the animal as if seeing a ghost. Nora stood, arms instinctively spread in front of Zephyr. "It's her," she said quietly. She came back. The old woman's jaw trembled. "That's not her, Nora. That thing should have died with the rest of it. She's not a thing, she's Zephyr. You don't know what you're bringing into this house." Her voice cracked, and not from anger. "You think it's just a horse, but it isn't. That animal carries death. You weren't old enough to remember, but I was. I remember the night your mother rode her. I remember the scream. I remember watching the lights fall and wondering if God himself had turned away." Nora's lips pressed together. "She didn't run. She stayed. She's not the reason." Her grandmother looked like she wanted to argue. But instead, she turned slowly and dragged the heavy curtain of her shawl tighter over her shoulders. She stared into the trees, then at the broken wall of the stable, as if trying to see through time. "Your mother was going to leave," she said. "She was going to take you and go with that damned circus. Travel the world. Sing songs and live in wagons. I told her no. I told her children need roots, not ropes. She said I was afraid. She was right." Silence. Then she turned to Nora, her voice trembling. "She died believing I hated her." Nora didn't know what to say. The words were too heavy. The air was too thick. So she didn't speak. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her grandmother's waist. The old woman stiffened, then softened, just slightly. "But she left something behind," Nora whispered into her side. "And I want to know what it meant." The old woman stepped back and looked at her granddaughter, like seeing her for the first time, not just as a child, but as someone standing in the middle of a history she never asked for. She nodded once, barely, then turned and walked back toward the house. Inside the cabin that night, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, the kettle hissed, and the shadows danced along the wooden beams, like memories with nowhere left to go. After the dishes were washed and the cough medicine taken, Nora sat at the kitchen table, notebook open in front of her, pencil shaking slightly in her grip. She wrote, "If I can't say it, I'll let the music say it for me." She closed the notebook and slid it under her mattress. Outside, the wind picked up. Then softly, faintly, there it was again. That sound, the tapping of hooves on dirt. A rhythm. Clop, 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 clop. In the distance from the stable, Zephyr's feet moved in time with a melody only she could hear. Not frantic, not forced. Just remembered. That night, Nora lay awake long after her grandmother's snoring filled the room. She stared at the ceiling, listening. Every few moments, the sound returned. Like a lullaby played by memory itself. Clop. Pause. Clop, clop. She closed her eyes and saw her mother, not the mother in the photograph or the one in her grandmother's bitter stories, but the one she had dreamed of floating in candlelight, hair backlit like a halo, harmonica in hand, smiling. She imagined her standing beside Zephyr again, bowing to an audience only she could see. The past hadn't died, Nora thought. It had just gone quiet. And now, note by note, hoof by hoof, it was learning how to speak again. The fever came like a thief in the night, silent, vicious, and without mercy. It started with a cough. Then the cough turned dry. Then deeper. By dawn, the old woman was trembling in her bed, skin damp with sweat, lips pale and cracked. The wood stove hissed, but couldn't warm her. The room smelled of eucalyptus and iron and something older, something brittle. Nora sat beside her, clutching a washcloth, dabbing her forehead every few minutes, watching the rising panic in her grandmother's eyes. "She's not here," the old woman murmured, eyes fixed on a point Nora couldn't see. "She said she'd be back. She promised." "Shh," Nora whispered, though her voice barely reached beyond her own chest. "I'm here." But the words didn't matter. Her grandmother's hands clawed at the blanket-gnarled fingers, clutching at air. "Amelie," she croaked, "don't leave the light on. You'll burn the tent." Nora froze. That name again? Not spoken in years. Her mother's name. She swallowed the lump in her throat and pressed the cloth against her grandmother's cheek. The heat beneath her skin was rising, as if the old woman were being consumed from the inside out. "I need help," Nora whispered. but there was no one to answer. She ran to the small table near the stove, where the battery-powered radio sputtered faint static. She twisted the dial, trying to find a station. Through the white noise, a voice broke through, tense, clipped, urgent. Mudslides reported across County Route 18. Repeat, Silver Pine is completely cut off. Flash floods have washed out the eastern bridge. Rescue crews unable to reach forest perimeter until further notice. Residents are advised. The words dissolved into static again. She turned the knob harder, shaking the unit. No, no, no. Outside, the wind howled, pushing against the windows, rattling the panes like something angry wanted in. The rain had been falling for 2 days without rest, but now it changed. It was heavier, more vengeful. It no longer tapped politely. It beat at the cabin like fists. Water was already pooling under the floorboards. Nora had stuffed towels against the doors, but they were soaked through. She looked out the window. The creek had risen. The edge of the woods was a swollen black ribbon now slicing the land in half. No one was coming. She turned back to the bed. Her grandmother's eyes were rolled back, chest heaving shallow, weak breaths. Her lips parted and moved again, but no sound came out this time. Panic rose like bile in Nora's throat. She grabbed her raincoat from the peg on the wall, shoved her feet into boots, and bolted outside. The wind slapped her across the face with cold fingers. Mud sucked at her heels. The trees bent and groaned under the weight of the storm. She ran. Through the backyard, past the stable, Zephyr nowhere in sight. She kept running. Into the forest. Deeper. Her heart pounded in her ears, matching the rhythm of the storm. She didn't know who she was calling for. Maybe the ranger station miles away. Maybe God. Maybe just anyone. She reached the clearing and screamed. Help! Her voice was ripped away by the wind. She screamed again. And again. No answer. The ground beneath her gave out. Mud. She slipped. Fell hard. Face first. Her hands plunged into freezing sludge. Her boots swallowed halfway to the knees. She tried to stand. Slipped again. Landed on her back. Eyes wide open to the gray sky. Rain poured directly into her face. She sobbed. Not just from fear, but from helplessness. From being 9 years old and carrying a dying woman on her back and knowing no one was coming to save her. She curled forward and the muck arms wrapped around her stomach, gasping. Please, she choked. Please, someone, anyone. There was a noise behind her. Not thunder, not wind. A thud, then another. Clop, clop. She turned half blinded by the rain and saw her. Zephyr, black as the storm itself, mane tangled, coat slick with rain. She stood at the edge of the clearing, head bowed, eyes locked on Nora. The rain danced across her back like it was afraid to touch her. Nora stared, disbelief and desperation tangled in her chest. She pushed herself to her knees. Zephyr took a single step forward. Nora sobbed again. Not from despair this time, but from something else. Something fierce. Something ancient and breaking open inside her, like light through cracks in stone. She stumbled through the mud toward the horse collapsed against her neck. Wrapped her arms around it like a child gripping the last solid thing in a drowning world. Zephyr didn't flinch. She stayed still, solid, breathing steady, as if she had known this would happen. As if she had waited for the moment. Please, Nora whispered, voice trembling against wet fur. Please help me. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix her. I can't lose her too. Zephyr turned her head slightly, her cheek brushing against the girl's hair. There was no promise in that moment. No magic, just a presence. But it was enough. Nora clung tighter. The storm raged around them, but something had changed. In the eye of it, girl and horse stood perfectly still. A pause, a breath, a decision made in silence. Then Zephyr lifted her head, ears twitching. Nora pulled back, looking into her eyes. And for the first time, she saw something. Recognition, no more than that. Remembrance. Zephyr had seen this pain before. She had lived it. She knew what it meant to lose someone you couldn't name anymore. And in that gaze, they became mirrors. Nora nodded, wiping rain and tears from her cheeks with the same shaking hand. I'll follow you, she said. She didn't know where that faith came from, only that it was real, and that it was hers. Zephyr stood in the downpour, unmoving. Wind tore through the clearing like a scream held too long. Trees bowing and snapping in waves of resistance. But the black mare remained still, grounded, her eyes wide, with the weight of something ancient stirring inside her. Nora's arms clung to her neck like roots, to stone her whispered plea still suspended in the air between them. Then, as if summoned by the storm itself, Zephyr lifted her head, her ears tilted forward. She let out a cry, shrill, fractured like a trumpet blast through a funeral march. It wasn't just a whinny. It was a call, a rupture, a declaration. Then she moved. She stepped away from Nora, circled once in the mud-soaked clearing, nostrils, flaring muscles coiling beneath rain-slicked skin. And then she ran, not a trot, not a hesitant gallop, a charge. She snapped through the half-collapsed wooden fence behind the old stable like it was paper shards flying into the air. A burst of wood, a flash of black, and then nothing but the storm swallowing her whole. Her hooves pounded the earth like war drums echoing through the mountain like a prophecy on fire. Clop, 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 clop. They hit dirt, then gravel, then wet leaves, and still she moved faster. Branches clawed at her sides. Thorns bit her flanks. A fallen tree split the path. She leapt it without thought, without breath. The woods blurred around her, the edges of the world melting into streaks of gray and green. She didn't hesitate, because something inside her had broken loose. Not fear, memory. Somewhere in the rhythm of Nora's harmonica, those aching fractured notes, something had been awakened in her chest. Not the memory of tricks and rains and lights, but something older, something truer. A connection, a command, a promise. And now she was keeping it. Rain lashed her face. The flood had turned the lower trails into black rivers. But she didn't stop. The current pushed against her legs. She pushed back. She moved like grief that refused to be buried. She moved like she remembered why the music mattered. The old path, the one that wrapped around the base of Pine Ridge, had long been forgotten by people overgrown and slick with moss. But Zephyr knew it. She had taken it once years ago when she was led by hands she trusted, carrying a girl with fire in her eyes and a song in her heart. Amelie. She had taken this same path on the night everything shattered. She had felt her rider fall. She had heard the screams. She had run, not away, but toward something she couldn't name. And then came the whip. It hadn't been meant for her but for the chaos, but it found her anyway. Split her shoulder open, branded her with pain that never truly left. It wasn't just the scar the whip left behind. It was the shame of losing her, of failing to hold her up, of being part of the night that silenced the music. After that night, Zephyr had never run like this again. But tonight she flew, through the trees, through the rain, through the dark. The clouds split for a moment, revealing the moon above full silver wide-eyed. Its light struck her side as she leapt another embankment. For a flash, the scar on her shoulder glowed. Not ugly, not broken, lit, like a symbol, not of what had been taken, but what had endured. She reached the gravel road by dawn. The forest opened into a wider path, no longer wild, but forgotten. Weeds clawed at the edges. Potholes filled with water reflected flashes of the sky. Ahead, a brick house, tucked behind a veil of weeping willows, chimney-long cold paint cracked from seasons of silence. Zephyr slowed, walked now, her breath heavy. Her legs coated in river water and mud, her mane in tatters. She stepped closer, no gate, no lights, but inside a figure, alone, watching from behind a window that hadn't been cleaned in years. Arthur. His hands were still, his eyes wide. He didn't blink. He had been dreaming about that horse for years. Always the same dream, a field of song, and her eyes staring back like she never left. He opened the door slowly. Rain still fell quieter now, as if it knew something sacred had arrived. Zephyr didn't approach. She stood there, soaking, breathing, waiting. Arthur stepped onto the porch. He didn't say a word. He looked at her, at the scar, at the mud on her flanks, at the chain around her neck, Nora's makeshift lead rope now soaked and trailing like a banner. And he knew. Her daughter, he said aloud, voice raw. Zephyr flicked her ears. Arthur descended the steps. He raised a trembling hand, and this time she didn't pull away. He touched her shoulder right over the scar. She didn't flinch. He lowered his forehead to hers, and everything he had buried, the music, the tent, the guilt, the endless ache of having outlived Amelie, rose like steam between them. He closed his eyes. I thought you were gone, he whispered. Zephyr breathed once. Deep, slow, steady. Arthur looked up, mouth barely moving. She sent you, didn't she? Zephyr lifted her head, turned slightly toward the forest. Arthur followed her gaze. The ridgeline. Beyond it, silver pine. A house. A girl. A melody reborn. Arthur stepped back barefoot now, rain soaking his shirt, and nodded. A silent pact. He went inside, grabbed his satchel, his coat, his harmonica, the same one that hadn't been touched in over a decade, and stepped back out into the storm. Zephyr turned. Arthur followed, and together they disappeared into the trees. Arthur hadn't spoken a word since he followed Zephyr into the forest. Not when the rain turned to mist. Not when the sun pushed its tired light through the canopy. Not even when the narrow trail beneath his boots shifted from pine needles to the crumbling edge of memory. Now he stood just inside the cabin's threshold, soaked to the bone shoes caked in mud. His hands were trembling, not from cold but from recognition, from contact, from the sudden weight of a name buried so long ago it had stopped sounding like language and started sounding like music. Amelie. Zephyr stood beside him, unmoving. She looked around the cabin as if remembering where things once were. The layout had changed. The piano was gone. The rugs had been rolled up, never replaced. But the walls remembered. The air remembered. Arthur closed the door behind them. Silence fell heavier than the years. He reached up, unwrapped the soaked scarf from his neck, and let it fall to the floor. His eyes flicked toward the corner of the room, toward the brass hook where the old halter still hung. Zephyr's halter. The leather cracked and weathered. The nameplate half-faded Z Windlight. He moved toward it, lifted it from the hook with a slow, deliberate motion. His fingers hesitated, brushing the worn metal buckle. He didn't look at Zephyr, but she turned her head. Their eyes met. He whispered, "You remember this, don't you?" She didn't make a sound, but she didn't look away. Arthur's chest rose with a breath that sounded like it came from a man twice his age. He knelt down, and with care far gentler than his weathered hands should allow, he slid the halter over her head, tightening the strap just enough for memory to settle in. And then for the first time in 13 years, he laid his hand against her cheek. It was like touching fire and snow at once, every buried thing inside him, igniting and freezing all at once. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," he whispered. Zephyr blinked slowly. Behind him, the room waited frozen in time. He turned. Dust shimmered in the pale light leaking through the windows. Sheet-covered furniture, cracked floorboards swollen with damp. But on the far wall above the old phonograph hung the poster. He crossed the room, boots echoing on wood. He stopped in front of it. It hadn't faded as much as he thought. There she was, Amelie, laughing mid-spin, harmonica raised in one hand, the other stretched toward a rearing Zephyr. The crowd behind them blurred in watercolor haze, but Amelie's face was vivid, joyous. Untouched by the ending she never saw coming. Arthur raised a trembling hand and touched the image, fingertips hovering over her cheek. "I told you not to do the turn blind," he murmured. "I told you we needed another week before the drop." He pulled his hand away, ashamed by how easily anger still found him. He had stood in this room hundreds of times since, but he'd never spoken to her photo. Not once. He stepped back, turned to the piano bench, lifted the lid. Sheet music lay inside, yellowed and soft. Waltz for Wind. Her handwriting, clean and looping margins, filled with doodles and rhythm notes. He sat down on the bench. It creaked under his weight wood, groaning like it remembered too. He didn't open the music. He didn't have to. His eyes went to the far wall, to the harmonica case mounted above the mantel. It hadn't been touched in over a decade. It gleamed faintly beneath a layer of dust. Arthur rose, slowly crossed the room again, and reached for it. The moment his fingers brushed the latch, Zephyr cried out, a long, high-pitched whinny that sliced through the room like a conductor's downbeat. Not frantic, not alarmed, intentional. Echoed. Arthur stopped. He turned. Zephyr's ears were forward. Her chest was rising, eyes locked on him. He opened the case. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was her harmonica, the one she used the night she died. He picked it up. It was heavier than he remembered. Cold. The metal dull from age, but intact. He held it in both hands. Then slowly he brought it to his lips. His breath caught. The room felt too small, the air too thick, but he exhaled anyway. A single note, soft, bent, almost a sigh. Then another, and another, each one trembling, each one truer than the last. It wasn't Waltz for Wind. Not yet. It was just memory. Translated. He didn't notice the tears until the harmonica slipped from his lips, and he couldn't see. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, breath coming faster now. Zephyr stepped forward. Closer. She moved slow hooves silent against the floor until she stood beside the piano. She lowered her head, nudged the harmonica gently where it sat in Arthur's palm. Then she closed her eyes. Arthur looked down. He understood. Not just the song, not just the girl, but the reason she came. Zephyr hadn't returned for nostalgia. She had returned for something unfinished, something buried beneath guilt and silence and time. "She's her mother's daughter," he said, voice breaking. Zephyr let out a low rumble. Arthur stepped back, hands now steady. He placed the harmonica gently into his coat pocket, then turned and walked to the wardrobe, pulled it open. Inside, untouched, a long black coat. Tailored, stage-ready, still smelling faintly of sawdust and cedar. He shrugged it on. It was tighter across the chest, but it fit. He turned to the mirror. His reflection stared back, older, sadder, but still holding a spark. "She asked for me," he said. Zephyr lifted her head. He nodded once. "I'm coming." The wind had softened by the time Arthur swung a leg over Zephyr's back. The forest no longer howled, but whispered, branches brushing low like bowed heads, trees parting in quiet reverence as the old man and the ghost horse began their return. Zephyr moved with certainty, her hooves kissing the trail like a priest walking the aisle. Each step felt deliberate, familiar. The forest seemed to remember them both. Arthur didn't speak as he rode. He didn't need to. His hands, though worn with age, still knew how to hold reins. His spine, though bent by years, straightened with the rhythm of her stride. It was not the ride of a man returning. It was the journey of someone stepping back into a story he thought had ended. The memories clung to the trees like vines. Here where the spotlight used to shine through tent flaps and children squealed from the rafters. There where she first taught Zephyr to rear on cue, only using breath and rhythm. And then the bend in the trail where he last saw Amelie alive, harmonica in hand, turning to wink before she rode into the spotlight one final time. He closed his eyes as they climbed the last ridge. Zephyr didn't falter, didn't slow. She crested the hill with one final push, and there beneath them, bathed in evening mist, was Silverpine. The cabin sat small and bruised in the distance, wrapped in smoke and memory. Arthur exhaled. He nudged Zephyr once. She galloped, not wildly but with urgency, with memory in her bones. The kind of ride that feels like music played in reverse. It was nearly dark when Zephyr reached the yard. Her hooves sent gravel scattering as she came to a stop. Arthur slid down, boots landing solidly, hands already reaching for the door before he realized what he was doing. Inside, everything smelled like heat and fear. Nora stood in the hallway, barefoot, dressed damp from earlier rain. Her eyes widened as the door flew open. She stared at him, then down at the harmonica in his hand, then back at him again. Her mouth parted, but no sound came out. Arthur looked like the photograph. Older, grayer, but him, the man her mother once stood beside on stage. The man with the conductor's hands and a mystery no one ever spoke of. She began, voice cracking. He nodded. Arthur, that was all. She didn't ask how he got there, didn't ask why Zephyr had returned with him. Somewhere inside her, she already knew. She's in here, Nora whispered. Arthur followed without another word. The bedroom was dim, the only light a flickering lamp in the corner. The old woman lay under sweat-soaked sheets, breath-ragged eyes glassy. She was murmuring something incoherent, hands gripping the air as if trying to hold on to a memory that kept slipping through her fingers. Arthur knelt beside her. The air was thick with eucalyptus damp towels and the sharp scent of fever. He placed 2 fingers to her wrist, then leaned in. His voice came low. Firm. Eleanor. It's Arthur. Her lids flickered. He pulled a vial from his coat pocket, poured something dark into a spoon, lifted it gently to her lips. She drank weakly out of instinct, then coughed. Hard. Arthur didn't flinch. He dabbed her lips with a cloth, reached for a bowl of water, wrung out a fresh rag, all in rhythm, like a ritual. Nora stood in the doorway, watching him. Her eyes moved between the old man and the bed, between past and present. And something inside her finally cracked. She stepped into the room. She was still holding the notebook she'd carried all week. A small worn book her mother once scribbled in. Inside were half-finished phrases, chord progressions, ideas written in ink so faint they looked like memories pressed onto paper. Do you know this? Nora whispered, flipping to the middle. She held the page toward him. At the top, in looping script, Zephyr's Waltz. Arthur froze. His hands fell to his sides. He stared at the page, like it had just spoken. I found it in her trunk, Nora said. But it's not finished. Arthur took the notebook gently, eyes scanning the measures. He reached the bottom of the page, where the melody just stopped. No final cadence, no resolution, just an open chord, waiting. He looked up. I know this piece. Nora nodded. I heard you play the first half once. When I was little, before she died. Arthur turned the page. Blank. He blinked slowly, then handed the notebook back. She never finished it, he said quietly. Because the night she was supposed to was the night she died. He didn't look at Nora when he said it. He looked at Zephyr. The mare stood just outside the bedroom window, visible through the glass. She hadn't moved. She was facing the door, head held high, ears twitching with each breath from inside. Arthur turned back to Nora. Do you know why she only whinnies when you play? Nora shook her head. Because that song isn't just music. It's a key. Your mother tuned it to her. Every phrase, every interval. Zephyr doesn't respond to notes, she responds to memory. Nora's eyes welled. Arthur knelt beside her. You opened something, he said. You woke something up. She looked down, then handed him the harmonica. Arthur turned it over in his palm, ran his thumb over the edge, then smiled, just barely. I think it's time we finish it. And this time Nora smiled too. Not just from hope, but from knowing she wouldn't be finishing it alone. The silence in the room was no longer quiet. It had shifted like weather changing behind the walls. The kind of silence that isn't absence, but pressure. The kind that wraps itself around you and won't let go until something breaks. Until something finally dares to speak. Outside, Zephyr stood motionless beneath the window. Rain clung to the glass in fine mist, as if nature itself had paused to listen. Inside, Nora sat at her grandmother's bedside, the harmonica and unfinished sheet music resting between them, like a truce carved out of old wounds. Then from the bed, a rasp, a stirring. Nora leaned forward, heart climbing into her throat. The old woman's eyes opened slowly, the pupils swimming toward the lamp's glow like someone returning from a far country. For a moment she seemed lost, staring past Nora through her blinking in confusion. Then her gaze shifted, settled. Recognition came not with a gasp, but a slow crumble of expression. She reached for Nora's hand and wept, not the soft, polite tears of old women in movies. No, she sobbed silent, cracked sobs that wrenched her body in trembling waves, as though her soul had waited years for permission to grieve, and finally, it had been granted. Nora pressed her lips together to keep from crying too soon. Her fingers gripped the edges of the quilt, unsure whether to pull it tighter or peel it back and demand answers. Then through the tears, the old woman spoke. She was too bright, she whispered. That was her curse. She believed in magic, and I taught her to dream. And then I punished her for dreaming too much. The sentence hung in the air like smoke rising from something scorched. Nora blinked. Her voice cracked. You said she was selfish? That she left? That the circus, I lied? Her grandmother said quietly with the stillness of someone laying down a weapon. Not to hurt you. To protect you. From what I couldn't admit. Nora leaned closer. She didn't leave us, she asked, barely breathing. Her grandmother shook her head. She died still loving this place. Still believing she could change it. A creak at the door. Arthur stood in the frame, face heavy, eyes unreadable. She didn't need to change it, he said. The town needed to change for her. The old woman glanced at him. Her lips tightened. The scars between them weren't fresh, but they weren't faded either. Arthur stepped further in. His boots moved in rhythm, as though stepping into a piece of music not yet played. She wasn't selfish. She wasn't reckless. She was a woman who refused to live small. He looked at the old woman, then at Nora. And for that, she was punished. No one ever understood her here, the grandmother said, voice quiet. They saw her riding that horse through the square, harmonica blazing like a battle cry, and they turned away. Said she was putting on a show. Said she wanted attention. She wanted freedom, Arthur replied. She embarrassed me. Arthur's jaw tightened. But he didn't raise his voice. She scared them, he said. That's what this is really about. This town built fences around their lives. She rode right through them. The old woman turned to Nora. I told the town she ran off with the show. That she chose lights over responsibility. That she wasn't fit to raise a child. Her voice trembled. But the truth is, she was on her way back here. To stay. With you. Nora's mouth fell open. Sheet was coming home. The old woman nodded. She sent a letter. I burned it before you could see it. I couldn't let her be right about life. Silence. Then Nora stood. Slowly. The notebook in her hand fell to the floor, pages fluttering open, like wings broken on impact. You made me think she abandoned us. I know, her grandmother whispered. You made me believe she chose a horse and a stage over her daughter. I know, she whispered again, voice raw. Nora's shoulders rose with shallow breath. I loved her anyway, even with your stories. I loved her in spite of you. Arthur stepped between them, not forcefully, but like someone protecting a spark from a coming wind. He looked at Nora. She died with the song unfinished. But not the story. That's yours now. Nora trembled. I don't know how to forgive someone who erased my mother. Arthur shook his head. You don't have to. Not today. But you can begin. The old woman's eyes flooded again. Her hands reached toward Nora, not pleading, not pulling, just reaching. And for a long moment the girl stood still, torn between the version of the past she'd lived and the truth now laid bare. Then she stepped forward, knelt, wrapped her arms around the woman who raised her in silence and shadow, and cried, not from pain, but from the unbearable release of hearing what should have been said a decade ago. I just want people to remember her, right? Nora whispered into her shoulder. Not like they did. Her grandmother nodded slowly, then placed a hand over hers. We will, she said. Starting now. Outside, Zephyr whinnied once. Not loud, but clear. A note struck through memory. Inside, something shifted. Not broken, not repaired, just transformed. The flyer went up 1 week before the performance. A single sheet of paper tacked to the corkboard outside the post office, fluttering in the breeze like a dare. Handwritten in thick black marker, the words leaned slightly to the left. Zephyr's Waltz. One night only. Community Hall. Saturday, 7 p.m. Featuring Zephyr, Nora Hollis, and special guest Jude Ellis. At the bottom in smaller print, for those who remember. For those ready to remember differently. Most people ignored it. Some scoffed. Others shook their heads and muttered about circus ghosts and that old horse. But some read it twice, then a third time, then quietly mentioned it over bread counters and gas pumps like a secret they weren't ready to believe. A horse performance in the middle of town with the Hollis girl and that mute Ellis boy. Silverpine hadn't seen a show in years. Not since the last county fair, which ended in a brawl over a pie contest. Certainly not since the night the Hollis family disappeared behind the smoke of tragedy. But still the flyer remained, and in the shadows of its ink, something began to shift. Arthur had borrowed the key to the community hall from the sheriff's assistant, who lent it reluctantly, warning him not to get anyone riled up again. The hall smelled of dust varnish and old pride. It took 3 days to sweep the place out, hammer down loose floorboards, and hang curtains that didn't reek of mildew. Arthur brought in 2 spotlights from his garage, and Nora strung them from rafters with rope and quiet prayer. They worked in silence mostly, until Jude arrived. He didn't speak. Not because he couldn't, but because the world had taught him there was no reason to. At 9 years old, Jude communicated with his hands, his eyes, and on good days, with his laughter, which was rare, sharp, and always brief, like a miracle you barely notice until it's gone. He had heard Zephyr's hooves from the woods behind his house. He'd followed the sound barefoot, stepping through mud and brush like it was music pulling him forward. When he saw her rearing slightly to Arthur's beat, then dropping down on cue, he'd gasped. And when Zephyr stomped once, then twice perfectly in rhythm, Jude clapped his hands and let out a full-bellied laugh that made Arthur look up and Nora spin around. The boy didn't hesitate. He walked right into the clearing. Didn't touch Zephyr, just stood beside her and started tapping the rhythm with his foot. It took Nora exactly 10 seconds to know he needed to be in the show. Arthur gave her one long look, then nodded. They practiced every day at dusk. Nora on harmonica, Arthur on cues, Jude beside Zephyr with a tambourine made of scrap wire and bottle caps, tapping it with fingers calloused from silence. The final note of Zephyr's waltz had been the hardest. It wasn't written. No one knew how it was supposed to end. For 3 days they tried every combination. Rise and fall, major key, minor key, accelerando, ritardando. Nothing felt right. Until one night, Arthur handed the harmonica to Nora. Said nothing. She played the whole piece from beginning to near end, and when she reached the final measure, paused, then breathed in, and let one single note bend upward. Not in triumph, not in sorrow, but in release, like exhaling the weight of someone else's story and letting it go. Jude's eyes sparkled. Zephyr stomped 3 times. Arthur smiled. It's done. On the night of the show, the sky turned a bruised orange behind the mountains. The chairs filled slowly. Older couples, curious children, a few teenagers whispering behind their sleeves. Half of Silverpine showed up to mock it. The other half showed up because some part of them wanted to be wrong. The lights dimmed at 7:04 p.m., and onto the wooden platform walked Nora barefoot, hair braided like her mother's. Once was harmonica clutched in trembling fingers. Behind her, Jude tambourine, tied to his wrist with blue ribbon. Then Zephyr, a slow walk, measured. Her coat gleamed black beneath the spotlight, muscles rippling like smoke held in shape. She took center stage and stood tall. The room held its breath. Arthur stepped into the shadows, hand raised, then dropped it. Cue! Nora played the first note. It rang out sharp and unsure, then steadied. The melody unfolded, familiar but deeper, like it had grown through soil and shadow, not just sheet music. Zephyr lifted her front left hoof. Stomped, spun. The crowd gasped. Then again, stomp, rear. The music rose. Jude struck the tambourine too soon, then again on time, and then perfect. Together they built something, Nora's harmonica flying, Jude's rhythm grounding it, Zephyr translating it all into movement, her body speaking the language of grief, rebirth, and remembrance. The performance lasted exactly 7 minutes. By the end, no one clapped. They couldn't. They were too stunned, too cracked open. And when Nora played the final unwritten note, that single bending upward note, something in the air released, like a sigh the town had been holding in for 13 years. And then applause. Slow at first, then growing. Not polite, not obligatory, but thunderous, alive, real. Arthur stood backstage, one hand over his chest. He whispered, "She would have loved this." The mayor was the first to walk up after. Didn't say much, just nodded once, tipped his hat, then walked away. Others followed, shaking hands, offering thanks. Apologies in the shape of gestures. One woman pressed a folded paper into Nora's hand. "My mother danced to your mom's music once," she said, and never forgot. Nora opened it, a photo of her mother and Arthur and Zephyr, and behind them rows of faces from this very hall. Cheering, believing. Jude leaned in, saw the photo, and smiled wider than he had in months. Nora looked up, saw her grandmother standing at the back of the room, silent, tears tracking down her cheeks, but no longer broken, just full, whole, transformed. Zephyr stepped off the platform, walked toward her. The old woman reached out, touched her nose. "Thank you," she whispered, "for bringing her home." The final light dimmed. No one in the room dared speak. The wooden floor of the community hall creaked softly beneath the weight of expectation, like the building itself remembered a different time, a forgotten rhythm. Nora stood center stage, eyes closed. The harmonica polished now, from weeks of use, and memory rested against her lips. She exhaled not just air, but everything. The guilt, the doubt, the silence she was raised inside. What came out wasn't just music. It was breath woven with blood. A daughter calling back a mother through melody. The first note quivered slightly sharp, as if unsure it was allowed to exist in such a sacred space. Then came the second, more rooted. The third, stronger still. Zephyr's ears flicked toward the sound. Her body shifted, adjusting to a familiar, ancestral rhythm. With every note, she stepped not as an animal trained, but as a soul reawakened. One hoof forward, then another, deliberate and synchronized, tapping in harmony with the girl's rising melody. Then Jude. He stood stage left, tambourine strapped to his wrist, his entire body still. Then his foot tapped. Then a hand. A beat. He struck the tambourine on the downbeat, eyes locked on Nora. She nodded ever so slightly. The room inhaled collectively. The music swelled. Zephyr's waltz had never been finished before. But now, It surged through the walls, like something that had always existed, waiting to be remembered. Each note felt old and new, at once sculpted from grief resurrected through forgiveness. Zephyr began to move in earnest. She reared slightly at the crescendo, then stepped sideways in a turn, stomping once on the downbeat clop. Then again, clop, clop. The sound echoed across the hardwood floor like a war drum softened by velvet. She was not performing. She was remembering. In the front row, a boy whispered, "She's dancing." The crowd leaned forward as if the air had thickened. Something unspoken passed through the room, from chest to chest, tightening throats, watering eyes. Fingers clasped, shoulders trembled. No one laughed now. No one muttered. They watched, and listened, and felt. Arthur stood just behind the stage curtain, eyes glistening. For a moment he didn't move. His hand hovered over the invisible baton he'd once wielded before thousands. The muscles in his back had forgotten what it meant to lead. But his heart remembered. He stepped into the light, slowly, like a man approaching a grave or a miracle. He didn't say anything, just raised both hands in silence. Then, downbeat, Nora's melody shifted into a brighter key. Jude matched the beat with crisp, clean strikes. Zephyr reared gently twirled in a tight circle. Arthur's face lined with years of buried guilt, now moved with startling grace. His fingers floated, then cut the air with precision, resurrecting a tempo long thought dead. A gasp rose from the back row. The music bloomed, and beneath it, the sound of hooves, steady, thunderous, like a pulse returned to a long, silent heart. Clop, 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 as if the entire room had become one massive body, one breath, one heartbeat. And then, from the rear of the room, sitting beneath the stained glass window that hadn't caught the sun in years, Nora's grandmother lifted her head. Her eyes were wet, but focused. She blinked once. And in the center of the stage, not in the horse, not in the girl, but in the space between them, she saw her daughter, Amelie, standing barefoot, dress rippling with some unseen wind harmonica to her lips, head tilted slightly, smiling. Not a ghost, not a shadow, but a presence. The old woman clutched the armrest, breath trembling. No one else seemed to see her, but she did. She wept quiet, wrecked free. "Thank you," she whispered, and this time she meant it for the right person. Arthur's hands moved through the air like a sculptor carving sound. Nora leaned forward into the final movement, fingers flying over the harmonica's worn metal. Jude's tambourine rang out in staccato bursts, mirroring her phrasing. And Zephyr, she paused, then reared one last time. Hooves high, then down. Clack! Both front legs struck the stage with a shudder. Not aggressive, not desperate, but precise, like punctuation. A full stop, then silence, absolute. The note lingered in the air, a single bending vibrato drifting upward, then gone, and all that remained was breath. Then, a ripple. From the back of the room, someone stood. Clapped, once, then again. Another voice joined, then a dozen, then the entire room. The sound of hands striking palms filled the hall like rain after a long drought. People were crying, openly, shoulders shaking, mouths trembling. Laughter bubbled between tears. Nora lowered the harmonica. Jude stepped beside her. Zephyr stood like a monument chest, heaving, but still poised. Arthur bowed, slow, deep, like he was laying something down he'd carried too long. Then he turned, faced the girl, held out his hand. Nora took it. They walked to center stage. Behind them, Zephyr stepped forward. And there on that weathered floor, under a spotlight paid for by loose change and borrowed time, Zephyr lifted one hoof, paused, then struck it once. Hard. Clop! The sound rang out like a heartbeat amplified. A heartbeat that had stopped for over a decade. Now returned. The final symbol, the last rhythm, and the first breath of something whole again. The house didn't change overnight. It creaked the same in the morning and held on to its shadows the way only old places do. But slowly the silence inside it began to shift. Not because it was gone, but because it was no longer heavy. It breathed now through open windows, through the laughter echoing in the hallway, through the smell of fresh paint and the faint sound of a harmonica drifting down from upstairs. The town didn't forget what happened that night at the community hall. They couldn't. Something had cracked open that evening. Something long buried beneath dusty assumptions and decades of whispered judgment. So they gave back, not because they were asked, because they were moved. The old donation jar Arthur had placed at the back of the hall, meant only to cover light bulbs and borrowed chairs, overflowed within hours. Someone called the local paper. Someone else launched a crowdfunding page. Within 5 days, they had enough to patch the roof, replace the stove, and rebuild the porch that had once sagged under the weight of fear. By the second week, volunteers began showing up. The mayor with his sleeves rolled. 3 high schoolers with more heart than hammer skills. A retired carpenter who remembered Amelie's last ride and admitted quietly that he'd misjudged everything. They painted the exterior a soft pine green, planted lavender along the fence line, repaired the barn doors. The house didn't become something new. It became something restored, a place where music lived again. Jude, too, became something more than he had been. People no longer looked at him with pity. They watched him with awe. He'd never spoken a word, but no one doubted he had a voice now. After the show, a counselor from the next county over contacted Arthur. She specialized in music therapy, particularly for nonverbal children. She'd seen the video someone had posted online, the clip of Jude tapping his tambourine eyes, a light fully present inside the rhythm. She said he had something rare, a musical intuition that couldn't be taught. She wanted to meet him. So Arthur and Nora drove Jude down to the studio one Thursday morning. He was nervous, but when they placed the violin in his hand and let him pluck one string, his entire face changed. That same night, they enrolled him in the program. Within months, Jude was performing in recitals, tucked in the back of the stage, half hiding, but playing. Always playing, always tapping, always smiling. The town of Silver Pine did something remarkable that spring. They looked in the mirror and decided to change. It wasn't loud. No legislation, no parades. But someone proposed an idea at a council meeting. What if once a year they held an event to honor those who had been misunderstood, those whose art or love or difference had been too bright for their time? They called it the Day of Memory and Music. It was held every spring, the third Saturday of April, when the air was warm, but the mountain still held the last shiver of snow. The school children played instruments they'd made from scraps and dreams. Elders read letters they never sent. The town square filled with music, laughter, and the smell of roasted corn and forgiveness. And every year at exactly 7:04 p.m., a single harmonica note was played from the center stage. Then the hooves, always the hooves. Zephyr never returned to the spotlight. She didn't need to. She belonged to the forest now, to the folds of twilight and pine. She lived quietly in the pasture behind Nora's house when she wanted. Sometimes she vanished for days. Into the trees, into the mist, into something no one could name. And always, she came back. Nora never tried to stop her. Because some spirits aren't meant to be tethered. They're meant to roam, to return when the music calls. Zephyr wasn't a pet. She was family. She slept beside the stable, walked beside Nora during her morning hikes, stood at the edge of the field during thunderstorms, like a sentinel. She was the last living piece of a woman who had never truly been allowed to live out loud, and now finally she was home. On the 1-year anniversary of the performance, Nora stood at the edge of the forest, alone. Her grandmother had passed peacefully 2 months prior. A smile on her face, and Amelie's locket in her hand. Her last words were simple: "Play the waltz for me." Arthur had moved to a cabin by the lake, still writing music, still drinking too much coffee, still keeping a framed photo of Zephyr on his desk. Jude had just been accepted into a junior music conservatory. And Nora, she was 17 now, wiser, stronger, still quiet in her own way, but not silent. She lifted the harmonica to her lips and began to play. The melody was different now, not Zephyr's waltz exactly. A new variation, softer, curved with experience, threaded with light. She played into the wind. The trees leaned in, the stream hushed, and then the sound, a single hoofbeat. From deep within the woods, clop, then another, clop. She smiled, didn't turn, didn't need to. She knew. Behind her, the townspeople listened too. They'd gathered without being asked. No stage, no flyers, just picnic blankets and quiet anticipation. They heard the notes. They heard the hooves. And though none of them saw her, they smiled. Because healing doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes on 4 hooves, in a clearing, with a girl and a harmonica, and a rhythm that says, "You're not forgotten. Not anymore."